G'day IB psychologist. These are the hardest essay questions to answer in the IB psychology exams, or at least I think so. Questions about research methods and ethical considerations. They're really tricky. But the good news is, that just means if you can explain research methods and write a really good essay, it's far easier to distinguish your work from everyone else's. So in actual fact, if you're well prepared, I think you probably have a better chance of scoring high on the essays. Now, how are you going to do that? Well, that's exactly what we're going to cover in this video. We're going to look at correlational studies used in the study of PTSD. We're going to look at what, how, why. These are three questions I think govern all of IB psychology. We're going to review what are correlational studies, how are they used to study PTSD, and then why are they used. And I'm going to use these three examples to support that. Right, so first of all, let's look at what is a correlational study. So unlike an experiment looks at an independent variable and a dependent variable, right? So it's got a directional effect. In correlational studies, don't talk about IVs and DVs. We talk about covariables. So these are, as one variable changes, so does the other. All right, and so in correlational studies, researchers gather data on two covariables, and then they calculate a correlational coefficient to see how strongly they are related. Now that correlation coefficient might range anywhere from -1 to a +1. Right, -1 is a perfect negative correlation, +1, perfect correlation, perfect positive correlation. How are they used? Well, like I just said, so researchers gather data on the two covariables. Now, applying this to PTSD specifically, the most common covariable in PTSD studies is symptoms of PTSD, right? That makes sense. And the most common method to measure PTSD symptoms is the clinically administered PTSD scale, or CAPS for short. Now, adding this level of detail in your essays is what's going to separate your answers from the rest, right? If you can remember CAPS, or even better, you can remember clinically administered PTSD scale. That is how correlational studies are conducted. They gather data on that, right? So they conduct the interview, it's a structured interview, and they measure symptom severity. But then they also gather data on another covariable. And so in Gilbertson, for example, this was hippocampal volume, and that was correlated how large the hippocampus was. Their measurement correlated with CAPS. In Hitchcock's study, they measured negative appraisals in children. So how many negative appraisals was correlated with the CAPS scores. In Irish, one of the correlations they calculated was based on income. Again, that's calculated with CAPS. So how are they used to study PTSD? Researchers gather data on two covariables. One of those is CAPS scores, and the other is a factor hypothesized to affect PTSD, whether that's the brain, cognition, like appraisals, or some social cultural factor like income. Now, why I like using these three examples, these three studies, is we've got a biological, cognitive, and a socio-cultural study here. You're going to be revising these anyway, possibly for any possible etiologies question in IB psychology. So we know what a correlational study is now, and we know how they're used. So why? Why are correlational studies used to study PTSD? Well, if we think about it, all these three variables are things that are very difficult to manipulate in an experimental situation. You're not going to have many volunteers sign up to have their hippocampus damaged to see if they're going to get PTSD. And also, all these participants, so they have PTSD already. In an experiment, it's very unethical, it is unethical, to conduct some sort of experiment that you think might lead to develop symptoms of PTSD, because they're all negative symptoms, right? Nightmares, flashbacks, intrusive memories, hyperarousal. So it's unethical to conduct these experiments. It would be unethical to conduct these experiments manipulating factors that you think are going to cause PTSD. Now, what's the alternative to that? We can use animal studies. But with animal studies, the big limitation is we can only really look at biological factors, right? We can't manipulate appraisals in a rat. We're not really going to cut a rat's pay, for a month and give one rat more money and the other rat not as much money, right? And see how that works. So we're quite limited with the animal experiments there. And also when we're measuring PTSD in rats, we have rat models of post-traumatic stress disorder, but that's only behavioral. There's no cognitive symptoms or other, symptoms that we can study. So correlational studies allow researchers to look at possible relationships between these naturally occurring variables that could lead to PTSD. Okay, so now we've looked at the what, how, why, right? What, covariables, correlation coefficients, how, gather data using CAPS, correlate with another factor we think is going to lead to PTSD. Why? Because we can't manipulate these variables in an experimental situation, and it would be unethical to try to induce PTSD. We study people who already have post-traumatic disorder or who have already experienced a traumatic event. Now let's look at these 3 studies to support that what, how, why explanation. So Gilbertson's study was a twin study where one twin was a veteran, and some of them have developed chronic PTSD. Now in these participants, they found a negative correlation of negative 0.64 between hippocampal volume and CAP scores, right? So they used MRI to measure the hippocampus, and what they're thinking here is that small volume in the hippocampus could be a risk factor for PTSD, and there's a lot of other evidence to support that explanation. In Hitchcock's study, they studied children, 7 years to 17 years, right? So the older bracket, right? Young adults. Anyway, 7 to 17-year-old participants, and these participants had been in some sort of accident, like a car accident or an accident at home. They'd been through some sort of traumatic event. And the researchers gathered data at 3 different times. Immediately while the participants were in hospital, 6 weeks later, and 6 months later. They used the CAPS, but it was actually, it's a tool slightly developed from CAPS, so it's designed specifically for kids, right? And what they found was a positive correlation. It sounds positive, but it's actually a bad thing. Hang on. Positive correlation between negative appraisals and PTSD symptoms. So what's an appraisal? Appraisal is thinking about the trauma. Do you think you can cope with it? Are you going to be okay? And so a negative appraisal means that you're feeling like you're not going to be able to cope. It's too much, right? The traumatic event is going to be quite damaging. And so positive correlation meaning more negative appraisals, more symptoms of PTSD. Okay, so this gives us a possible cognitive etiology of post-traumatic stress disorder. Now finally, in Irish's study, similar to Hitchcock's, these participants had been in some sort of accident, but these were adults, and actually they had all been in a car accident. Now not one big car accident, right, all just various different car accidents. So over a period of time, the researchers gathered their data while the participants were in hospital. Now this study was actually looking at gender differences and trying to think about why females are more at risk for developing PTSD following trauma. What they found, one of the correlations was a negative correlation, negative 0.23, between income and PTSD symptoms, again using CAP. So they give them a range of questionnaires, and in one of those questionnaires they measure their income levels, negative correlated with CAPS. Now this is similar to a lot of other studies that suggest socioeconomic status, where our level of wealth could be a factor influencing PTSD. In fact, people from lower socioeconomic status groups are more at risk for developing PTSD following trauma. Now that could have something to do with the amount of resources that you have to deal with the trauma, right? So for example, being able to pay for therapy, things like that. So there we are, 3 studies that show that I think support really well. Like, what is a correlational study, right? So they use the CAPS, they calculated correlation coefficients. How are they used, right? We gather data on some factor we hypothesize is influencing PTSD, right? And we correlate that with PTSD symptoms. And why we can see, well, we can't really manipulate brain volume in an experimental situation, nor can we manipulate income. And appraisals is pretty difficult as well. And we're not going to try to induce PTSD in the lab. Now, I think that's a pretty good explanation with 3 pretty good studies. But then we have to think about the but, right? So if you've looked at my other videos about how to write essays and how to show critical thinking. So if you think, a good introduction would be introducing briefly, here's what, how, why, these are the studies I'm going to use, and then the question will be, because it's paper 2, it's an essay, evaluate or discuss, and then you would have to have some sort of evaluation here. Now the classic evaluation of a correlational study is correlation doesn't mean causation. I've got a whole other video where I explain how to evaluate that in depth and evaluate it properly. So what we want to try to do is, first of all, go and watch that video, and then come back and look at these 3 studies and see if you can apply that evaluation to these 3. So for example, we're hypothesizing here that it's A influencing B, but could it work in the other direction? Could it actually be B influencing A, or could there be a third variable that explains why these 2 things are correlated? Okay, and so that's real deep critical thinking. Okay, there we are, right? So what, how, why, but correlational studies based on PTSD and abnormal psychology. Now I would use these exact same studies and the same kind of methodology if the question was about ethical considerations. I think the most relevant ethical consideration in correlational studies, especially on PTSD, is anonymity. right? You're gathering CAP scores. Do you really want to publish people's PTSD symptom severity? You're also gathering data on highly sensitive factors that might be correlated with PTSD, like volume in the brain or your income. And so we can apply that explanation of anonymity to the methodology of correlational studies. If you had to have another explanation, another consideration, ethical consideration, perhaps consent, right? You need these two studies, right, went into the hospitals to gather data after people had just had some sort of traumatic event. Do you really want to be bothered by a researcher, right? And also this is based on children who would need parental consent to be involved in this. So it's consent from the participants themselves, but also parental consent, because you know that you're going into the hospitals gathering data, and you're gathering data on highly sensitive information. All right, so there we have it. Research methods, plus also be prepared to write about ethical considerations. All this is in our revision book and all our other materials, which you probably know by now, but links in the description, and go check them out. And if I feel a little bit tired right now, it's because I've taken about 5 takes to explain this video. So I hope it works, and I'm trying really hard to talk slowly, so I hope that was helpful. Good luck. Cheers.